Take me to heart, and I'll always love you. And nobody can make me do wrong. Take me for granted, leaving love unshown. Makes willpower weak and temptation strong. A woman's only human. You should understand. She's not just a plaything. She's flesh and blood, just like her man. If you wanna do right, hold day, woman.
Thank you, Aretha. That's as good a way as I can think of to get into our topic today. Our topic today is kind of the confluence of things. Towards the end of the show, we'll be talking about the Aristophanes play Lysistrata, which kind of introduced the idea that women might withhold sex in order to gain peace. In our middle segment, we'll talk about how that exact idea was applied to the suffragist movement in the early 20th century. But we're going to start with right now, particularly in the wake of the recent November election here in the U.S., there's been more talk about how women might assert themselves against a rising tide of misogyny and comments in the manosphere and worse, and also how that has gone in other countries. And here to do that is Min-Ju Lee, an assistant professor of Asian Studies at Occidental College, and Cecile Simmons, a researcher at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, focusing on gender extremism and digital culture. Her forthcoming book is... it's CTRL, but Control, Hate, Delete, the new anti-feminist backlash and how we fight it. So we're going to begin with the so-called 4B movement in South Korea, and Min-Ju Lee is going to help us get into that. Min-Ju Lee, welcome to our conversation. And for people who are unaware of this, despite quite a bit of publicity about it lately, explain what this movement is in South Korea.
Hello, Colin. Yes, the 4B movement stands for refraining from four things, more specifically refraining from heterosexual marriage and reproduction, and also dating and sex. So it's a movement that has been going on in Korea among some radical feminists for quite a while, and it has been catching on in the U.S. since November.
And let's talk a little bit about South Korea. This is an interesting movement in a whole lot of different ways. But one of them is that it occurs against the backdrop of a lowering birth rate in South Korea, which in turn has spurred some incentives by the government, or the government has attempted to stimulate that birth rate. Some of this feels like there are other things it's a backlash against, but that seems to be one of those things, right?
Yes, you point out that an interesting thing about the steeply declining birth rate in South Korea, and the government has been doing a lot of things, financially speaking, in order to support or help out in any way to increase the birth rate. But the problem that a lot of women face, and some of the reasons that they are choosing not to marry or have children, isn't a significant part of it is money, but also there are some other parts of it, such as systemic inequality that they feel, and also the fear that once they are married and have children, that their careers will end, and that there aren't any social support networks that will help them further their careers on top of being a mother. So there are other factors that the government hasn't necessarily addressed that the 4B movement is attempting to address or bring into the social limelight.
Yeah, in my reading about this, it seemed as though the gender disparity of pay in South Korea, I mean, it's not great anywhere, but it seems as though it's exaggeratedly bad in South Korea.
Yes, so there have been a lot of women who were interviewed on news media and documentaries explaining why they chose to not engage in reproduction in particular. Some of them do marry but decide not to have children. And a part of it is that there are in South Korean society nowadays, pretty difficult for a couple where only one person earns a living. Two people it has to be a double income family for them to be sufficient enough financially speaking. So the women fear that if they have children and that they are going to somehow be kicked out of their companies or workplaces or have their pay severely cut because they are not available always every day, then that's going to severely impact not only herself, but also her family and children.
So, and this will lead us very well into Cecile's work as well. One of the differences between this kind of movement, the 4B movement, and some others we've seen historically is it's not clear that there's a back end solution. In other words, it's not clear that there's something that the government or men collectively could or would do that would change some of the feelings surging up behind 4B. And reading your work, I get the sense that some of this is that South Korean men, a certain percentage of South Korean men, seem almost irredeemably sexist, given to partner violence, given to the use of cameras to intrude on women's privacy. You list a whole bunch of those things. That there's a kind of manosphere culture in South Korea that is pretty toxic. And would that be a fair representation of your thinking about that? Okay, we might be having a technical problem here. Let me just see what happens if we move over to Cecile, and then we can see if the problem is entirely on one side. Cecile Simmons, one of the things that you built on in the piece that you did in The Guardian, that I'm sure is also going to be in the forthcoming book, is the way the manosphere reacted to the election of Trump, almost as though it was a validation of a lot of the things that they believed and a permission structure to say even more aggressive things, the your body, my choice thing being kind of an example. But can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I think that the renewed interest in the 4B movement is really a sort of backlash to the backlash. And the anti-feminist backlash across the global north has really grown in the last few years. And it has been closely connected to the mainstreaming of the manosphere. And so, indeed, I think what we're seeing is a lot of reaction to a reaction. And we saw very clearly that after the election, a lot of misogynists felt emboldened. We've seen a lot of men use misogynistic slogans to abuse women online. But that has been really building over a number of years. Back in 2022, we saw the rise of people like Andrew Tate, these misogynistic entrepreneurs who, are exposing millions of men to their ideas. And so women's discontent has grown as these movements have gained traction. And so I see it not just as something that's happening post-election, but as something that has grown quite consistently across many countries in the global north.
Yeah, and Cecile, we should say a little bit more about the manosphere. I don't know if every single listener is familiar with this, but this is a movement that attempts to reimpose a very traditionalistic and fairly reductive view of man and woman relationships. They've appropriated, in most cases, the vocabulary of the movie The Matrix. They talk about red pills and blue pills. If you're blue-pilled, you are comfortable with the current advancement of women in society with ideas of equality and equal opportunity. But if you take I think I always get the colors mixed up. I hope I'm doing them right. But if you're red pilled, then you see what's really true, quote unquote, which is that men need to be superior to women. Women need to be in a subservient role. That's the way things are supposed to be. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more about this philosophy and where you think it's coming from.
Absolutely. So the manosphere is this collection of different online communities that have been around for quite a while, but for a long time they were confined to forums, blogs, a few offline movements. But really in the last, 5 years, they have been amplified, and they have been brought to millions of men through charismatic influences. And the manosphere promotes the idea of socio-sexual hierarchies, the idea that everyone has a sexual hierarchy, and that I suppose men are also losing out in more gender equal society. And so the only way out, according to the manosphere, is for men to optimize themselves into alpha men, but also to coerce women. And what the manosphere promotes is an adversarial view of gender relations, the idea that women are the enemy, other men are the enemy, and there is no relationship based on trust and respect. But, women need to be manipulated and coerced into relationships. And of course, women have realized that these ideas have reached a lot of men because they can experience that when they go on dates and they meet men on dating apps who have been exposed to these ideas. For a lot of women, this feels very personal.
Yes, as it should. So back to you, Minju Lee. Maybe say a little bit about South Korean men. Not all South Korean men, obviously, but one of the driving forces behind the 4B movement is this sense that some of these young men are almost irredeemably sexist, and not just sexist, but inclined to engage in things like partner abuse or to secretly be videoing women in bathrooms and things like that. Could you say a little bit more, Minju Lee, about how it is in South Korea?
Yes, definitely. As Cecile just mentioned about the larger context of manospheres, in Korea that exists as well, where there are these very radical ideas about gender that are formulated in online circles and echo chambers among some men. And it's not entirely clear who is participating in these communities if you are looking from the outside and are not a member of that community yourself. So a lot of women, or not a lot, some women, feel that they can't trust some of the men, especially because there have been rising news articles that talk about extreme violence that some women face if they try to break up with their boyfriends, some resorting in violence, some resorting in murder and stalking. So there is some kind of fear, even in interactions with men, about whom to trust, whether it is going to be safe for them to actually end the relationship if they want to and are no longer in love with a person, or if they have to fear for their lives if they want to say, I want to break up with you.
So, Cecile Simmons, this is not confined, these movements are not confined to South Korea or to the U.S. We're really talking about global movements here, and you've studied and written about some of them. Explain what's happening in some of the other countries you've looked at.
Absolutely. So, as I said, this is a trend, that's sort of gender polarization and the growing distrust between men and women's desire to disengage from men is something that's happening across different countries. I've looked at France in particular, which I think is interesting in the sense that for a long time, France was the country of romantic exceptionalism. There was always this idea that the French do things differently. And what we're seeing now is that some of the interest in women's separatist movements is growing in France as well, as is the so-called sex recession, especially among Gen Z people. So that is interesting to observe. And that's really been the result of growing anger from women against what they perceive and what they rightly perceive as inaction against abuse. So especially what we've seen in France is that, contrary to the US, the Me Too movement has really failed to take off. Of course, the backlash was there in the US against Me Too as soon as it happened. But in France, it's really failed to take off. And as allegations against powerful men emerged, a lot of people came to these men's defense. And a lot of women feel that institutions are powerless to defend them. And at the moment in France, there is a mass rape trial that has really shaken the country, that is taking place, and that has also global resonance. And when we see these mass rape trials and this woman whose husband invited men to rape her in her home, I think we're really feeling this undercurrent of anger. And against that, we've seen indeed a sort of revival of second wave women's separatist movements, the idea that we should really go into communes and disengage from men, which in my opinion only goes so far in protecting women. And it's not really what I suppose helps everyone, although that is a respectable choice for those who want to take it. But it's certainly tells something about the way women feel.
And this includes, in your piece in The Guardian, you talk about this political lesbianism, this idea that one makes a choice towards lesbianism for political reasons as a reaction to some of the things we're talking about.
Absolutely. So political lesbianism is the idea of making the choice to not necessarily have sex with women, but to not have relationships with men. And it's an idea that has been around for a while. It's an idea that was popular among sections of second wave feminism, but it never really took off for probably obvious reasons, because the majority of women are still attracted to men. So it's somewhat quirky to see that revival today, but I think it speaks to a certain, I suppose, new radicalism from women. As men become radicalized, we're seeing women become radicalized in some ways, not in the same ways, but we're seeing a desire for something different and something new. And that it can take on many shapes, not just what we just talked about.
I just want to say to anyone listening, if any of this is starting to trigger you or make you feel as though you recognize a part of your life in it that's disturbing to you, the National Sexual Assault Hotline provides 24/7 support for survivors of sexual assault and their loved ones at 800-656-HOPE. That's 4673. And at the hotline, RAINN.org. Last thing for you, Cecile, and then I want to get back to Minju Lee. Some of what we're talking about right now in terms of the behavior of men, the rhetoric of the manosphere, is probably a little bit in reaction to the fact that, at least in the U.S., men aren't doing as well. Young men aren't doing as well as they might expect to be doing, or perhaps as well as they did in the past in terms of college attendance and graduation rates and jobs and things like that. We hear that they're losing the kind of foothold that they have had in the past. And I'm wondering if you see in your research some sense of that causing this sort of overreaction in the form of aggression.
What I'm certainly finding is that the manosphere quite often will superficially shine a light on these real problems. The problems are not imagined, they're real. What is then imagined is I suppose what's constructed around that is the narrative that it's because of feminism and because of women that these problems are happening. And this idea is really powerful because it gives men, I suppose, an easy target, an easy I suppose, scapegoat. And I think that's what's making the ideas of the manosphere so appealing. And so I'm certainly, I suppose, the background, the socioeconomic grievances are absolutely there, and they are contributing to some of these feelings resonating. But I really think that the echo chambers and the online rabbit holes is really what drives a lot of men to these adversarial ideas, because what I've looked at in my book in particular is when you look at offline discussions and groups and community work that engages with men, you can really reach men and have these nuanced conversations that never happen online. And therefore, I think that social media gives you a slightly distorted picture of what men really feel.
That seems very reasonable. Minju Lee, it's probably important to note that 4B has sort of sister movements connected to it, including one that mentions the idea of the corset, an idea that the kind of beauty myth for South Korean women is in itself an oppressive form of valorizing or extolling or putting on a pedestal a very specific set of ideas about feminine beauty. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yes, definitely. So the Escape the Corset movement is what it's called, and it's a movement where some women cut their hair short oftentimes and then decide that they aren't going to have any plastic surgery on their bodies and that they're not going to wear makeup or engage in any kind of cosmetic products. And that's because for a long time in Korea, there has been a very big popularity of plastic surgery for young girls. There has been a trend for several years in the past of high school students, once they graduate from high school and are during their winter break between high school and college, their parents or somebody, they themselves would gift themselves plastic surgery as a gift for graduating high school and then going on to college. So they would do surgery on their faces a little bit to beautify themselves before they become formally adults. So the Escape the Corset movement is kind of problematizing that, saying, oh, there is an undue ideal of feminine beauty that's placed on these young girls, and therefore we are going to start this movement that is going to question all of these feminine beauty ideals that are placed on these young girls who are beautiful as they are.
So let's go back for just a second to the 4B movement. This is the no heterosexual dating, sex, marriage, or childbirth. How much of a foothold has it gained in South Korea?
So there needs to be a slight difference made between people who are ideologically engaging in no sex and no marriage and no reproduction, and also the people who are not doing marriage or reproduction because of financial reasons. There are a lot of people who are not engaging in marriage or reproduction because of financial reasons, not necessarily ideological. So in terms of the people who are participating specifically in the 4B movement because of ideological reasons or gender-related issues, they're pretty minor.
All right, so we have to stop there, although this is fascinating stuff. Min-Ju Lee, Assistant Professor of Asian Studies at Occidental College. Cecile Simmons is a researcher at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, focusing on gender extremism and digital culture. Her forthcoming book is Control, Hate, Delete, The New Anti-Feminist Backlash and How We Fight It.
Let mother vote, we raised you after all. Won't you thank the lady you have loved since you were small? We reared you, cheered you, helped you when you fell. With your blessing we could help America as well. Let mother vote, we'll keep our country clean. We'll tidy up.
That's from Shana Taub's Broadway musical running right now, Suffs, about the suffragette movement in America. We're going to be talking about that. It's interesting that musical is on Broadway right this second, and I don't think it's an accident either. We are now going to talk to Tania Shew, a research fellow at University of Oxford, who has a book in the works, tentatively titled Sex Strikes and Suffragettes. Tania Shew, welcome to our conversation.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
So we're kind of locating this conversation pretty much in the first 2 decades of the 20th century in England, in the U.S., but also other countries, also Germany in particular. Maybe we'll be able to talk about that. But this is something that suffragists are talking about. It's turning up in the minutes of their meetings, and I would imagine in their journals and stuff like that, that they are considering using an idea similar to the 4B movement in Korea, which we just in South Korea, which we just talked about in the previous segment, a similar kind of movement at the time. Tell us a little bit more about what it is they're contemplating.
Yeah, exactly. So as you reference, a really key part of this story is that these strikes, as imagined by suffrage campaigners, didn't actually take place on the mass scale that many of them dreamt of. But they did really dream of and imagine and consider and debate this set of tactics. We think probably many thousands of women encountered these debates either by attending meetings on the topic or by encountering fiction on the topic, because we see plays about this theme, or writing into magazines. And as you imply, a similarity with the movement today is that we see both this proposed sex strike and a proposed birth strike, just like how in the 4B movement there are these 4 components.
Yeah, one difference would be, I think, in the 4B movement, we would have already talked about the fact that it's not quite clear that there's a back end to the movement. Like if you do this, then we'll change what we're doing. Whereas I think it's much more clear. I mean, it's a suffragist movement. This is really about creating a motivation to give women the vote. Or am I being oversimplistic about that? Is this much more of a kind of a broader response to a broader critique?
I think there are 2 points here. On the one hand, you're totally right that a key part of the early 20th century sex and birth strike movement is that it is a strike. I think it's really not a coincidence that they're using this strike language specifically, which is obviously language we associate with the labor movement normally, but it is a rescinding of something with a set of demands, often the vote, sometimes economic demands. But at the same time, I think also within this movement, within the sex and birth strike movement, we do see a wider emotional response, a discontent, maybe an impatience, a desire to change things in the here and now before there's the vote. So on the one hand, yes, you're totally right. It's a set of tactics. It's a means where there's a really clear end. But there is also this urgency and a hope that the tactics will change things, change a culture in and of themselves.
You know, you said that, and it's clear from your research, that it doesn't appear to have been implemented on a widespread basis, although it was definitely discussed on a widespread basis. Although I guess I have a question about how would we know? I mean, one of the aspects of this is that it will happen in an essentially private context. In other words, I don't think it would be hard to count noses here and know how many people were implementing this. But so as a researcher, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And that's one of the fascinating things about this proposed tactic is it's a protest movement. It's something we therefore traditionally think of as taking place in the street, but instead it's taking place in such a personal sphere in the home. You're right, therefore, we can't exactly know how far the strikes are actually implemented. We don't know about those very private personal conversations that might have taken place within couples or those very personal decisions. And we even do have one suffrage campaigner herself who refers to it as the silent strike and who predicts that perhaps this is already happening, perhaps it's already taking place and we just can't measure it. So we don't know, but suffrage campaigners were interested in that themselves.
Right. And, there's this whole concept within protest of arrestability. I mean, if I go out and protest something, I'm a fairly entitled white male with a highly visible job. If I get arrested, I'm going to be out on bail pretty quick for whatever I was protesting. Not everybody has all those advantages. So this, I would assume, I mean, there are, for all I know, there probably were laws on the books in some countries saying that women had to be compliant with sexual demands of their husbands. But by and large, they're not risking arrest maybe at the same level if they went marching down the street.
Yes, you're right. And we do see shadows of that similar discourse. And one of the questions that always interests me is, why were suffrage campaigners interested in this set of tactics? They had very established, famous tactics that many of your listeners might be aware of. In Britain, there's the very famous hunger strike, for example. Why do they also start to become interested in the sex and birth strike? And I think from the sources, one of the reasons is exactly what you describe. It's seen as a way of being militant and shocking and daring, but where a larger group of women can participate in the tactics, because women who, for a variety of reasons, cannot risk arrest, can maybe be militant in this distinct way.
So one of the things that intrigues me anyway is that in South Korea, they have the world's lowest birth rate right now. In this period that you're looking at, birth rate, I think, is slowing down a little bit. And women are no longer, in some cases, just these baby factories who have to just get going at the age of 17 or 18 and start pumping out children. And I'm wondering if the suffragists realize that this is maybe an area that's a little bit more sensitive than it used to be, that it's a softer solar plexus that you can hit the patriarchy in. They're already worried about the birth rate. So what would they do if you even took control of it more? I don't know. Am I making any sense at all?
Yes, you are. And certainly, as I'm sure we're seeing now, different women engaging in these historic sex and birth strike debates have different theories for the strikes and different motivations. But we definitely do see examples of suffrage campaigners trying to depict what might politicians be fearing and hypothesizing in exactly that way you just described.
There's also some interesting things going on. Well, first of all, we should say that there's an uneasy way in which this rubs up a little bit against eugenics. That there are people like Margaret Sanger who are very interested in this, but to the extent that eugenics is this controlled breeding for certain desirable characteristics, and that there's a racist and ableist, not even subtext to it, but just text to it, there are ways in which it might be, holding hands a little bit, these two ideas. Can you say a little bit about this? Obviously, the suffragists are not eugenicists, but it's at times there's kind of a danger that they're getting a little bit braided together.
Yes, definitely. I think holding hands is a really good metaphor there. Obviously, these movements are existing in the same moment. And I think the call for a birth strike isn't synonymous with eugenics. And I think the way it is different from the most traditional classic eugenic arguments is that many advocates of birth striking were prescribing the birth strike for themselves. This wasn't something they were saying only another group of people should participate in on race or class grounds. They were saying they were personally going to participate in the birth strike. But you're absolutely right that many of these women in making that argument admitted that they either formed coalitions with eugenicists and shared campaigning spaces with race and class-based eugenicists. So I think holding hands is a good metaphor there.
And there's some rich, if painful, ironies here. I believe Emma Goldman, the American activist, translates some of these ideas into Yiddish so she can introduce it into American urban immigrant communities. And of course, those are some of the communities that will be targeted by other people who are eugenicists. Emma sees it a different way. Why does she think it's important?
You're exactly right. I've noticed that irony myself, and it really fascinates me. That's actually an area I'm currently doing more research into and following more leads into for my book. So I'd love to come on the show when my book comes out and discuss that with you further.
Oh, I'd love to do that too. So let's just end with this. So in, I think, 1911, we get a production. Our final segment on the show today, after you, is going to be entirely about Lysistrata. But there's a Lysistrata production in 1911. There's, I think, a new translation. This isn't material that is even as widely known as it is today. The average person in the period you're looking at might not have known about this material. Aristophanes wasn't quite as well known. The translations weren't around. But there is a production. And talk a little bit about that, because I think for the most part, this is a very new, fresh, and original feeling idea. Sex strikes, birth strikes in the early 20th century. This is something that these women are thinking up on their own. And it must be a little bit of a surprise to find out it's not entirely new.
Yes, exactly. You're totally right. We have this tension. So on the one hand, these women are explicitly interested in sex and birth strikes because they see it as a new and exciting and fresh idea, and perhaps something that previous generations of male-dominated campaigners and activists haven't thought of. One person even writes of it as specifically a woman's idea. And yes, at the same time, they are encountering and inspired by and engaging with Lysistrata. And I think for me, this just really evokes an emotional parallel to now, because on the one hand, I think some people engaging with the 4B movement are excited by the newness, it seems. And yet also here we are now looking to history for a parallel, just as these suffrage campaigners saw themselves as innovators, but also were looking to the ancient world.
So we're going to have to stop there, but this is fascinating stuff. Yes, you absolutely have an invitation to come back on. Tania Shew, research fellow at the University of Oxford, when the book is ready for publication, Sex Strikes and Suffragettes. I may be a decentered male by then, but I'm sure the woman who's hosting this show will do a wonderful job interviewing you. But I hope it's still me. I'd love to continue the conversation. And we're back. Time to thank the maestro, Dylan Reyes. He's our technical producer today. This particular show is brought to you by Lily Tyson Quality Entertainment Productions. I don't love everything they do, but I think this has been very good. It's going to get even better. Right now, we're going to talk about the play that you hear me mention over and over in the show today. To do that, Elizabeth Bobrick, visiting scholar at Wesleyan's Department of Classical Studies, is joining us right now. Elizabeth, welcome to our show.
Thank you, Colin. Wonderful to be here.
So take us back to ancient Greece. I think it's 411 BC. Aristophanes, already a large looming figure as a comedic playwright, introduces this idea for people who are not familiar with the plot. And also, we have to agree on a pronunciation. This title is pronounced at least 3 different ways by actual scholars. So how do you like to say the title?
Classicists say Lysistrata.
Okay.
I don't think it's worth confusing people in order to adhere to that. So we can say Lysistrata.
However you want to say it, you're in charge here. But you give people give people a sense of the plot.
Okay. So the plot is the women of Athens, particularly one woman, the hero, or heroine, we should say, Lysistrata, says, sick of this war. This is set in 411, or this performed in 411, which is almost 20 years into a war that would last almost 30 years. The Peloponnesian War of Athens and her allies against Sparta and her allies. And the Athenians were losing, and things were desperate in Athens. So that is the actual historical setting for this play. Now, Lysistrata comes out at the beginning and she says, gals, I got an idea. We're going to take a solemn oath, no sex with our husbands, absolutely none, no matter what. And she has to kind of force them to agree, but she does. And then she brings in a group of Spartan women, and who are also okay with this idea, more than okay. So here we have enemy forces combining against a mutual enemy. And the reason they want to do this is they want to end the war. This war is terrible, a long, long war. The population of men has reduced markedly, and these are women with sons and brothers and fathers, so they want it done.
Yeah, and we should mention that not only is the Peloponnesian War raging at this time, and as you say, Athens is not doing particularly well in it, Athens has also previously, fairly recently, conducted an incredibly ill-advised invasion of Sicily, where a lot of Athenian men died for essentially very little gain. So there's kind of that, and there's come some instability right now, too. We think of Athens as this democracy that was kind of permanently in place for a few hundred years, but in fact, right around this time, Athenian democracy is going to temporarily collapse and then be restored a few years later. So this is a pretty jumpy environment for Aristophanes to be introducing radical satirical ideas, right?
Yes, it's an extremely unstable time. And in fact, democracy was really not that old in Athens and is not that much like what we think of a democracy, but that's for a different show. The wonderful thing about Aristophanes is that he will take a very fraught political situation, introduce a completely bizarre idea, and you have then a comedy of the imagination in which we see what happens if we pursue this idea. And this provides the bizarre nature of this proposition, and it would have been completely bizarre and not allowed, I assure you, is that it creates sort of a safe space for everybody to think about what the war is doing, along with heavy-duty political satire along the lines of Saturday Night Live. There's singing, there's dancing, it's like a Broadway musical, there's parody, there's wordplay. It's highly obscene, both verbally and visually.
We should actually pause there and say, and correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, but my understanding was that that traditionally, we should say that, first of all, what there isn't is women. There's no women on stage. All the women's parts are being played by men, but
Right.
men playing men, as I understand it, were in the habit of wearing these kind of leather phalluses. But in this particular instance, those leather phalluses are pointed upward to suggest a throbbing, unrelievable erection.
That is absolutely right. So there are two strands to this, and to the play. The sex strike is the one that pretty much everybody who knows about the play knows, and this is what your previous guests have talked about, the sex strike. But equally important to the plot of this play is that Lysistrata also gets the old women, the women who are, dried up crones, so to speak, and are not having sex anymore, and their husbands aren't interested in having sex with them, and they take over the Parthenon. Now, so they're going to be keeping men away from the treasury, because that's where the treasury was, in the Parthenon. And no treasury, no weapons, no ships, no nothing. So it's a two-pronged attack, if you will. And the play moves quickly into the scene of the Parthenon. And that's where most of the action takes place. The women hole up in the Parthenon. So the Parthenon means everything to Athens. Athena Parthenos, interestingly enough, that means Athena the Virgin, and she was impregnable, literally. So there they are, and the old men and the old women are fighting. The sex strike begins to crumble a little because Lysistrata's friends are really missing their husbands, and some of them are trying to sneak out, and they're coming up with these wild excuses, and some of them pretend that they're suddenly about to give birth when they weren't yesterday. So she has to keep everybody in line. But ultimately, she brings both sides together, the Spartan men, or Spartan men and a soldier and Athenian, and say, let us run things. We know how to run things. We run households. We can do this, and we do it peacefully, and we do it well. And then we can go back to the old days when Sparta and Athens were allies and we defeated the Persians, and things were just so much better. And sadly, at the end, we go back to the status quo. Lysistrata brings out an actor in a naked woman suit and says, "Here, this is reconciliation. This is her name. And why don't we make another name for her is treaty? So let's divide this up." So what happens is that the Spartans and the Athenians, each represented by one actor, say, "Well, I'll take this part," and I'll take this ass, and I'll take these legs, and it's all innuendo. They give actual geographic names, but they also have other meanings. And so everything goes back to the male possession of the female body. Yes. And that's not something that comes across when people talk about Lysistrata as this empowering women's sex strike.
Yeah, it's both subversive and conservative, ultimately, in the end.
Aristophanes presents these wild ideas and tends to return things to an improved but status quo, but still status quo.
Yeah. By the way, speaking of Persia, I think the jokes on Athens, I think Sparta and Persia wind up making kind of a deal that, in fact, does get Sparta some money and helps them win the war. So,
yes.
So there's sort of that. I want to just say, again, correct me if I'm wrong about this. It seems to me that Lysistrata is something of a subversive character in the sense that she's resourceful. She's funny. She does some of the wordplay that tends to be in Aristophanes' plays and are given to sort of smart, witty characters. Probably for Athenian comedy, women are often at that time depicted more frequently as drunk or horny or both. So in the sense that she's this very resourceful heroine who comes from a recognizable sector of Athenian society, is that kind of revolutionary in that depiction?
Well, two things. One is that there are two other plays that we still have featuring women trying to take over or trying to put men in their place. And so it's largely a cast of women, and they are very witty and resourceful. So yes, always lots of jokes about how much they love to drink, how much they like sex. That's across the board. But there are, the men get pretty rough treatment as well. Yes, she is an extraordinary character, and scholars have long noted that her name, Lysistrata, is very similar to the name of the chief priestess of Athena who protects the cities, Polias, Athena of the city, and her name was Lysimachie. So Lysistrata means she who disbands the army or the troops. And Lysimachie, the name of the actual priestess, the most revered woman, I would say, in Athens, means she who disperses the battle. So they're very, very similar. And that indicates a degree of respect that Aristophanes is bestowing upon Lysistrata.
So Robertson Davies once wrote, scratch a humorist and you will find a deeply serious person underneath. And that I think maybe is something we could just say towards the end here about Aristophanes. Obviously the things that we've talked about in this episode today are not funny. On the other hand, I think he's deeply serious about, despite being conservative, despite sort of ending with, well, let's just start having sex and everything will be fine again. Do you feel there is a seriousness of purpose in this play?
Absolutely. And it's not just having sex and things will be fine. It's like you'll stop fighting and things will be fine.
Yeah.
This is a deeply political play, and all of Aristophanes' comedies are. This was part of a festival, a civic festival, and that's kind of hard for us to wrap our minds around it. But this is civic worship of Dionysus. It was serious business. And so Aristophanes is always interested in politics, always interested in the political situation. And it really wasn't until feminist scholarship came into classics starting in the 70s that plays like this and like Women at the Festival were taken seriously. It was just a chance, before it was like a chance for the poor war-weary Athenians to laugh. Well, no, it's more than that.
Yeah, I think it is. All right, we have to stop there, but Elizabeth Bobrick, it's been great talking to you, visiting scholar in Wesleyan's Department of Classical Studies. To the rest of you, thank you for listening today. We will be back all week long with new shows for you.